So we have the movement here from the 6th line of the 59. And in this movement of being able to recognize or not what type of intimacy can really work, and the commitment to that intimacy is the entering into the marriage contract and the marriage bond itself. You know, for everybody who's hip, cool, and liberal, I'm sorry. I mean, according to the wheel, you know, you go from understanding the importance of intimacy and the need for it, and you get married. I mean, that's what it says in the wheel. So you go to the 40. You go to the 4037, which is the channel of the marriage contract itself. The great channel of bargains. The channel of community. And in its cross, we have the right angle cross of planning. That is the third variation in this quarter of duality. The right angle cross of planning. And this is the global theme that we're living with and have been living with since the beginning of the 17th century. That is the 40, the 37, the 16, and the 9. The 40th gate of deliverance is the gate of aloneness. It is the primary gate of aloneness, which seems odd considering this is part of the marriage contract. Part of the marriage contract is the sanctity of aloneness. This is something that is so important for couples to understand. Marriage eliminates loneliness, but it can never eliminate the need for aloneness. Never. And that the bond works best when the spaces can be separated. That is, when there is the opportunity to be alone without interference. The 40th gate is an ego gate. Please understand the nature of the ego motor. It's very important to understand how the ego works. The ego demands rest. The heart is a muscle. It demands rest. It is essential. Now the ego is part of the material plane. That is, the ego drives us on the material plane, and 3 of the 4 ego gates are part of the tribal circuit, including this gate, the 40. The nature of the way in which the heart motor works is that in its life curve, it tries to get an equation in which it gains more rest for less work. That's its equation in life. And it means that every time that the ego uses its energy, its willpower, that it has to have at the same time an equal or more amount of time as rest as a balance. If the ego does not get that rest, then you're going to have enormous problems, because this is the gate of denial. And the physical attributes of the ego, heart, stomach, they will begin to suffer. If the ego does not get its proper rest, this is the kind of type that drops dead of heart attacks under pressure, suffers from ulcers. And the key to this is that they must have this balance. So when you look at the black book above the lines, it says the point of transition between struggle and liberation. Between struggle and liberation. These are 2 aspects. The struggle is the use of the ego as will. The liberation is to put your feet up and be a couch potato. Don't try to get the worker who puts out their ego energy all day to work when they come home, because you're going to have problems and you're going to make your partner sick because they have to have their rest. And what they're looking for is a 37 on the other end that says, oh, you've worked hard today, dear. I made you your favorite dinner. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. The first line, the introspection, the foundation. It tells you exactly what the ego is all about, and it tells you what a successful contract in any relationship is all about. Recuperation. Rest. Rest. The Sun Exalted. The ability to relax and enjoy the fruits of one's labors. You know, I did my 8 hours, I got my money, and I'm free, and I can do what I want. That's what the ego's all about. Do not take rest away from the ego. Its life curve is to get to the point where it retires, does no work, and still gets money for it. That's the goal of all egos, is to get to the point where they don't have to work at all. You know, money for nothing, chicks for free. The moon in detriment. The moon cannot stand still. The ego uncomfortable with being alone too long. And the only difference is they need their rest, but not a lot of rest. That's all. But they must have their rest. And they have to have authority in that first line. And because they don't know the other very well, because this is lower trigram, they don't easily find the partner at the other end that allows them the rest. And they have to have the rest. That's why it's about bargains, relationships. You know, I do this and you do that. And when I've done this, I don't do anything. You do that. Don't bother me. I do this and then I do nothing. You do that. That's the bargain. If you don't cross that line, it works. It just works. But the moment you cross that line, every bit of energy you take from that ego, when it wants to rest, you pay a price for it. Both the person who calls it out and the person who has to live it out. Second line, resoluteness. This is a gate of aloneness. That's the only second line I have, is the 40, the second line. I mean, I really understand what it means. You know, it looks like I'm all alone. And it looks like I don't want anybody to bother me. And that's what people see. You know, sometimes I'm like that, sometimes I'm not. It's just projection. You know, it's nothing more, nothing less. That's why I ended up with all these sannyasins, these 37s. You know, they automatically just pull the bell of the 40 anyway, because they're always looking for that ego energy. Resoluteness, the power and authority in aloneness, to shed forever the qualities which hampered liberation. Aloneness is great. This is the great gate of denying God. Hey, this is the great gate of atheism. This is the great gate of saying, I don't need you. There's no God, there's no love. You know, it can be very, very clear about denying everything. I don't need that from you. I don't need your bargain. So when you call them out, you really have to be able to offer them a fair contract. Otherwise, they're going to reject it completely. The moon in detriment. A natural peacefulness that in deliverance, that in aloneness, may sympathize with and attempt to nurture the forces which have hampered it. And of course, what happens here is that you get called out and you go along with their bargain and you give up your rest. And it costs you, because at some point you collapse. This is the whole mystery of understanding the ego. Think about what that's like if you have an undefined ego. I mean, think about how devastating that can be for you if you're constantly being conditioned to the power of the ego without having built into you the genetics that will demand rest to go along with it. You end up burning out your stomach and heart system. It's essential. I had an extraordinary experience with the power of what happens to you when your ego gets conditioned. For many years, I have had Pluto. It's gone now. Many years, over 6 years, I had Pluto conditioning my ego by connecting my sacral system and defining my sacral system so that my ego was connected to it. And at the moment that that happened, I stopped resting. I mean, it was very good for human design, but I mean, it was driving me mad. The sacral center overpowers the ego. And the moment that the sacral connects to the ego does not have the power to control its rest time. And so you go and you go and you go and you go. Now I have a lucky constitution, so I survived it. But think of all the ego people that have sacral people in their life who strip away their rest time and keep them going by driving them with their sacral power. Understand how the ego works. The power through aloneness to recognize the importance and the potential disruptive effect of others. And that's what the second line learns in the Exalted. And in the detriment, the power of loneliness to blind the ego to the possible disruptive effect of others. They really get in the way, and you have to be clear. The bargain has to be clear. That's why there is a bargain there. The bargain is for the ego. It's not for the emotional system. It's for the ego. Because if the ego doesn't get its proper rest in the bargain, if it can't see that out of that bargain it will get more and more and more rest, then the relationship cannot work. A successful community is a community in which the amount of labor necessary to maintain the community gets less and less over time. That's success. The third line. The third line, obviously, in this gate of aloneness, is going to have difficulties in being able to establish a contract because it is a line of bonds made and broken, and it will make mistakes in the kind of contracts it gets into. So you get this nice humility. A calculated mode in aloneness to avoid attracting the attention of negative forces. A negative force is anybody that wants you to work when you're not ready. That's a negative force to an ego. Anybody who wants you to commit your power when you're not ready, they're not for you. Pluto exalted, the subtlety to enjoy aloneness without having to flaunt it. The capacity of the ego to avoid negative forces, even if it means being alone. And these are people that are happy being alone. Everything about the 40 is about suspicion. It's very suspicious. It's very suspicious of the emotional affection that's being offered to it. Yeah, you're very nice. What do you want? What do you want? This is the question that 40s always ask. What do you want? What's the deal here? What do you expect me to do for you? How much of my time do you need? Because that is what's important to the 40. And if the deal doesn't look good, they won't take it, because their natural instinct is to be alone and left alone, and to deny the fact that the other can really be of any value to it. I don't need friends. What for? They take up my time. And I don't seem to get anything in return. 40s can be very... Mars in detriment, the ego arrogance that demands attention and gets it. The capacity of the ego to demand attention. And these people demand attention by demanding their contract the moment they bang into you. The moment you meet these people, you know that you're not going to be able to get them to do things. Very hard to get egos to do things unless they really want something from you, and it's usually sex. The 40, which is a gate of aloneness, which is a gate of sexual denial, is only that when it doesn't have the 37 smiling at it. You know, when the 37 is smiling at it, there are twinges that take place in the body. And it really gets in the way of them saying, hey, look, I don't need that. And that's the moment that it's possible to enter into the bargain. Lower trigram does not have social skills. So here in the 4037, the channel of community, which is a very, very important social channel, it's the only social channel that automatically appears because it's an opposition channel, the 40 and the 37 being opposite to each other. It is the dominant, most consistent genetic social pattern we have. So it's very important to us. It is the very basis upon which our civilization is built. That is the community, the supportive community that thrives in the material plane. And it's the ego that makes that possible. But when you're in the lower trigram, the skills to recognize what community and who to make the bargain with, and what kind of bargain, is something they're not well equipped for, because they don't know what's at the other end. And they often get into a lot of trouble because they don't know about the 37 smile. They don't. You know, the 40, the first, the second, and third lines, it has no idea that there is that smile at the other end. It's going to make it forget everything it was thinking about. The upper trigram knows that there's the smile at the other end and knows what makes that smile work. That smile works when the ego works for the smile. And it's a trap. Now, it can be a tender trap. I mean, after all, human beings are designed to live in the illusion of separateness. That's our magnetic monopoles. And we have a evolutionary process and a binary process that bonds us to others. So we're dealing with something that, though it is our evolutionary pattern, we're still alone. And it's quite a thing to be able to fulfill that contract with another. It's quite a thing. And the more educated you are, the more difficult it is, because the more criteria are involved. The first bonds were easy. That is, I kill, we eat. You know, it was easy. It was basic. It was survival. And of course, we're much more complex today. Our bargains are much more complex. And so it becomes even more difficult for us to find a way, let alone to live with each other, but to tolerate each other long enough. It's the beauty of this knowledge. I mean, I'm a classic baby boomer. I have all the ex-marriages to prove it. And the reality is that without this knowledge, I would not be able to have stable relationships in my life, and I do now. And that comes out of the ability to be able to accept one nature and not to blame. So blame in human design. And the moment that you recognize that we are helpless, you can see that if you're given in your geometry another being, if you live out your nature and you accept that they live out theirs, it makes it a hell of a lot easier to live with people and to find that place in them that you can love or respect or enjoy. So the fourth line, the transpersonal, the gift of being able to know when to be alone and when to externalize. Remember, all fourth lines, rooted in the role of the 10-4, all fourth lines are opportunistic in nature. These are people that pick the right opportunity to rest. You know them in the office. You know, the moment nobody's looking, their eyes are closed. And then they jump up, you know. They'll wait for the perfect opportunity to take their rest. And they insist on that. And the perfect opportunity to enter into a bargain. They can be very good at making money. They can know exactly the moment to make the right bargain. Remember, everything's timing. Organization. The power to transform and the intuitive intellect to select and organize for the purpose of maintaining deliverance. That is the power of the ego when organized and active to maintain separateness. This is a real key. That is, no matter how engaged the 40 is, no matter what contract the 40 makes, it never loses its ability to stay alone. It doesn't enter into a job unless it can have its own cubicle or its own office. It can't, otherwise it's disastrous. It has to be able to go home and go into its room and close its door in order to be alone, in order to return to its separateness as its reward. I'm resting now. By the way, when the ego is resting does not mean it's not doing. Rest for me is writing a book. Work is teaching. They're both occupying. It's not about that you lay on your back and you do absolutely nothing. It's about the illusion of freedom that you get. That when your work is done, your time is your own. And it's that illusion that the ego lives by. It's designed to live that way. The detriment, Mars. An uncontrollable zeal that ignores the quality of support in preference for the quantity, which in the long run may destabilize its ability to be alone. Deliverance. The empowering of the ego through the capacity to organize others. Now look, this is all about being able to control the contract. It's always about that, being able to control the bargain. Remember that 4s make friends with you so that they can fuck you. Now you can think about that positively or negatively, because it's both what's active in that. So many people get screwed in their bargains. So the 4th line is trying to make friends with you. It's very good at that. It's able to externalize that. And of course, because it's the ego, when it has a good bargain, when it makes a good deal, it gets really puffed up. I only have to work 20 hours a week, you sucker. I'm getting 6 months off this year. The moment that Pluto left my ego alone, I stopped working. 1998 has been a wonderful year for me so far because I did so little. I took about 5 months off. And I had all kinds of people who were yelling at me because they expected me to be in certain places and do certain things for them, and my sacral wasn't there, and it was so easy for me to say, I'm not coming. Sorry. My ego is resting. How nice for me. It's the magic of the ego. Now, if you get away on a ego trip about that, I don't have to work, I have to work less, I make so much money that I blah, 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 blah. That's what happens in the 4th line. And of course, it happens in that they're telling that to the very friends that they're screwing, or not. It's nice to see that we have everything, When you get to the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of the 4th line, the design sun and earth change, and they change from the 16 and the 9 to the 35 and the 5. So you have the juxtaposition cross of denial, the 40, the 37, the 35, and the 5. These people are fixed on denial, and they deny the possibility of a decent bargain, and they deny the possibility of any kind of connection to God. These people are fixed on denying. It is one of the mysteries, the only gate, the only line that is purely purely, purely mystical of the 384 is the 54-4. It's a fourth line. And that means in the genetic continuity of all fourth lines can lie something deeply mysterious, deeply mystical. Those that dream of touching God go to their graves a virgin. And those who deny that God can ever be touched often end up being touched by God, or touched by the forces, or whatever kind of name you want to give that. So denial does not mean that there is no potential for transformation, satori, whatever. There always is. But it doesn't mean like that's a guarantee, because it's not. The left angle cross, for me, a very interesting cross. The left angle cross is called the left angle cross of migration. This is the 40, the 37. Remember, this is a cross that brings a definition. The 35 and the 5. Think about how this works. Planning, denial, migration. These forces, they really do move us. They create new communities and new places to live in and so forth and so on. They are driving forces to move away from what has been planned and structured in the bargain, because they think the bargain stinks. And they think a better bargain can be made. The fifth line. Rigidity. The recognition that to achieve liberation, all negative forces must be rejected. The revolutionary that demands absolute victory, that is, the power of the ego, is maintained in the rejection of negative relationships. The gift of the 5. Think of this image again of the hexagram as a house, and you've got the main floor windows, and that's where the second line is, and the lights are on and everybody's looking in. But you have the second floor windows, that's the 5th line, and the lights are off, and the 5th line's looking out. Those people who want to be friends with the second line know what's there. They want to make a bargain with the second line. They're reading something, because the second line is always open and visible to a certain extent. But the 5th line isn't. They're looking up, trying to figure out what kind of deal they can make with the 5th line without realizing that the 5th line can look and watch them and they don't see it. In other words, all 5th lines, the seducer seduced, all 5th lines are ready at some level or another for the projection that comes to them. And they watch those who do the projecting. Oh, I can tell immediately when somebody meets me by looking at their eyes which way their projection's going to go. I mean, I'm a 5. I know instantaneously which way that projection's going to go. You know, whether they project on me that I'm really of value to them, or whether I'm not, blah, 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 or whether I'm good or bad or right or wrong or nice or not, or all that stuff. It's all projection. And through experience, I know exactly what they're projecting in those narrow terms. So that rigidity is an advantage. That is, it's only going to enter into a bargain for victory. Victory is, the bargain is real, the rest is guaranteed. And of course, this is classic general. The generals out there in the countryside hasn't been doing anything but pick its nose for years. And then there's the right bargain. And it comes out of the countryside, it goes into the bargain, it does its thing, it makes its deal, it gets its reward, and then it leaves. Perfect. But only in times of crisis, and only when the bargain is practical. It's very important to understand that because all 5th lines represent the lines of exaltation in the traditional I Ching, and the moment you recognize that all 5th lines are what society is looking upon to fulfill the nature of a hexagram, what they dream the hexagram should be, can be, must be, that all of that is based on being practical and being practical at the right time. All of that. And it says something very profound about what humanity really wants. They just want what's practical and works. They don't want anything else. They want the most exalted consciousness to be practical and work. They want the most mundane apparatus to be practical and work. And of course, that's the power that the fifth, the universalizing line, can bring or not. If it has the right timing, if it has what's practical. The earth in detriment, a tendency in revolution to accept a certain amount of necessary deviation on the assumption that it can be successfully purged later. That is the weakness of the ego in its loneliness to maintain and not reject negative relationships. In other words, this is a bad bargain, but I still like these people. And I'm not going to blow them off just because it's a bad bargain for me. Now the ego and ego beings always carry a taste of martyrism and victimization. Always. Because it is the ego that is pressed upon to make the material world work. And it's only the ego that can do that. The streams of sensitivity and instinct that move through the tribal circuitry, they don't go to the throat, they go to the ego. You know, it is the ego that has to keep the whole material plane moving, and of course it's under pressure because of that. Don't make bad deals. And don't make bad deals with nice people. You know, the 45th line is really saying to you, you know, be careful when you lend money to your friends. It isn't saying don't do it. It's just saying be careful, because you may actually be giving it away. You know, and then you're going to have to work that extra bit to make up for that rest that you just gave them. Because that's what money is. The 6th line. Have you ever seen a 46th line kid? And it's the family picnic. And everybody's there around the barbecue. And everybody's together. Except for the 40, the 6th line. They're up on the roof. And they're looking down at their family. And they're saying, my father's a jerk. Look at him. My mother doesn't know what she's doing. Look at her. My sister is being unfair again. Watch her. Nobody is going to get enough food. Look at them. You know, that child sits there and watches everybody do their trip. And this is a child that always gets into trouble when it's young and gets its fingers burnt when it's young, because it keeps on insisting to its mother and its father that what they're telling it is unfair. This is the mantra of the 40. It's unfair. And of course it runs through this channel. It's just unfair. Decapitation. Heavy business, the 46th line. The necessary destruction of inferior forces in positions of power before liberation can take place. The Son exalted. The authority coupled with the magnanimity to remove from power only those who deserve such drastic treatment. The power and authority of the ego to eject individuals in legitimate defense of the group. So, of course, when those children are young, they get into a lot of trouble. I mean, they try to use their genetic gift to establish what is right and what is wrong and what's the bargain is within the family. And, of course, they have no power to do so. They're a child. They quickly get burnt. But they learn in their lifetime that it always presents them with a lot of trouble every time they stick their nose in and they say, this one is useless. Do something about it, or I don't join. And of course, they end up not being joiners. They end up coming into a room full of people, and they look at the way the structure operates, and they look at about the way it's led, and they know right away that they'll never be able to tolerate it.